So our next example of pedimental sculpture comes from the Parthenon, that famous temple to Athena, the maiden or the virgin that stands on the Acropolis in Athens. And this East pediment tells the story of her birth. Famously told to us in a Homeric hymn to Athena, she is said to have emerged fully formed as an adult in all her war gear from the head of Zeus after he swallowed her mother Metis. And you can see Hephaestus behind her in that reconstruction with his axe, who in this case actually acted as the midwife. When Zeus had a headache, of course he's in labour, along comes Hephaestus and helps him out and removes that part of his head for Athena to jump out. And, Greek mythology is weird and wonderful, and we shouldn't try to spend too long working out how this was possible or what happened to Zeus's head afterwards, which is, of course, the kind of questions I always get in class. Now, the reason why the birth of Athena is on this temple is because the whole of the Parthenon is dedicated to Athena because she is the patron goddess of the city of Athens. And with the West Pediment, we'll cover that story for how she came to achieve that role. But on the pediment here, it's just worth me coming first of all to the fact that we don't have all of the figures that once filled this pediment. The one at the top, the image at the top, is actually a reconstruction from the Acropolis Museum because we no longer have the apex. This was damaged when ammunition was stored in the Parthenon during the Ottoman Empire, and as you can imagine, that's incredibly dangerous, and it did end up blowing out the centre of the pedimental sculpture. But thanks to some drawings from a Frenchman called Jacques Carré, we're able to reconstruct what was once there. But we're going to mainly focus on what exists today. Now, Nigel Spivey says we can't be certain of the identification of any of the figures on this particular pediment because of a lack of attributes. But what I'm going to go through are the most commonly given names and titles to the figures that we can see. And we're going to go from left to right, starting with the image at the bottom. You can see some horses' heads there in the left-hand corner. They appear to be emerging from the ground. This is because they represent Helios's chariot, which is coming up in the morning to drive the sun across the sky. Next to them, we've got a reclining figure with a hand slightly raised, which is why he gets the title of Dionysus quite often, although some people do think Heracles perhaps there. Moving on to the two women next to, we'll call him Dionysus for now. Demeter and Persephone are the two most common identifications because of their proximity to one another. In fact, they actually have an arm around the other's back, if you look at it from the reverse side, but also they're sitting on a chest, a mysterious object, which makes people think perhaps this had something to do with the Eleusinian Mysteries, which was in Eleusis, a part of Attica, and involved the worship of these two goddesses. And then to their right, we've got a figure who is moving. We can see that from her drapery. And quite often, this is given the title of Hebe, who would be our female cupbearer of the gods, so the female equivalent to Ganymede. On the right-hand side of the pediment are three figures which you can see in the middle image. Commonly on the very far right, reclining and with the most transparent drapery, is thought to be Aphrodite. And then she may be leaning on her mother, Dione, and then next to her, Hestia. But as you can see, some of these figures don't have clear attributes. They're very similar to one another, which is why we've got that comment from Nigel Spivey before. But there is another scholar called David Stuttard who believes there is a reason why the figures are in a very certain order. And certain gods are on the left-hand side and others are on the right-hand side. And, the theory is very attractive. I'm going to go through it with you in a moment, but it does depend on the figures being exactly who he says they are. So the figures that we looked at on the left-hand side are all connected in some way with the underworld. If we look at the figure being Dionysus in the early archaic period, and in fact even before that, he is associated quite often with chthonic deities, those who are associated with the underworld, and also the issue of rebirth. Demeter and Persephone, as part of the Eleusinian Mysteries, are worshipped in order to gain a better afterlife. And then I said before Hebe is most common, but David Stuttard actually goes for Hecate here, who again would be another chthonic goddess in the sense that she's associated with witchcraft and magic. Whereas on the right-hand side, we have got figures associated with the world above. So what David Stuttard says is that if you read this pediment from left to right, you get a journey from darkness into light. And that, in essence, is a rebirth, with Athene's birth at the centre of the pediment as the most important birth of all. There'd be another reason why this was a very attractive theory, and that's because the Parthenon is being built as part of a rebuilding program by the Athenian statesman Pericles after the Persian Wars, in the decades after the Persian Wars. And therefore, Athens is going through a rebirth of its own. And therefore, if this theory actually is correct, it would be very fitting and therefore is very attractive as a potential theory. Some other interesting points about the composition of this pediment. Well, the corners, for a start, was a very innovative way of filling that space, having the chariot of Helios at one side and on the other side the chariot of Selene, the moon goddess, coming up in the evening. Up until now, we've tended to see reclining figures, dying warriors, but also river gods filling that space. So this is something new, something innovative. We've also got a flow of news throughout the pediment, so the people at the centre are more engaged and interested in what's going on, and then as that goes towards the corners of the pediment, people are less interested. So look at Dionysus at the bottom there. He's actually facing away from the other gods and is kind of in his own little moment there. It's also interesting to note that we seem to have a balance of opposites. So whilst you've got a nude Dionysus on the left-hand side of the pediment, you've got those draped women facing him on the right-hand side. And in fact, if we come to those draped women, those drapery techniques are absolutely stunning and definitely worth a note. So you'll be able to see the catenary or U-shaped folds around the chest and breast area of the women, emphasizing that area of their femininity. We can see the transparent drapery. We can even see the modeling lines at right angles over their legs, drawing attention to the curve of the leg beneath. And if you have a look at Hebe or Hecate on that bottom picture, then we can also see motion lines, or the fact that the drapery moves with her. So it's just absolutely stunning. And if you compare it to Aphrodite the Agora, which is contemporary day, you'll see how much more kind of clunky that looks in comparison. Finally, it's worth pointing out there's a slight problem with proportions on this pediment, because they've used a variety of poses this time rather than a strict solution to fill the space. But because everybody that appears in it is technically a god, it's a bit strange that we have some gods that are bigger than others. So that's one element that doesn't work. But you could say that the most important gods for the scene or the narrative are at the centre, and therefore it seems appropriate that they are larger than the others. Finally, I'm going to put a picture up when this video finishes, a bit of a close-up of Dionysus, because he just shows you that we've got very typical high classical style bodies going on here for the males, and you can compare him to the Doryphoros by Polykleitos as a really close comparison.